From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
President Trump is indicted for a fourth time, this one by District Attorney in Fulton County, Georgia. What does the indictment say, and is the legal threat also a political one? Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, columnist Bill McGurn and editorial board member Mene Ukwe-Barua. Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis has been investigating President Trump's efforts to overturn the 2020 election for years now, but late on Thursday night, the 98-page indictment finally came down. Let's start with Fani Willis at the press conference last night announcing the charges.
The indictment alleges that rather than abide by Georgia's legal process for election challenges, the defendants engaged in a criminal racketeering enterprise to overturn Georgia's presidential election result. Subsequent to the indictment, as is the normal process in Georgia law, the grand jury issued arrest warrants for those who are charged. I am giving the defendants the opportunity to voluntarily surrender no later than noon on Friday, the 25th day of August, 2023. I remind everyone here that an indictment is only a series of allegations based on a grand jury's determination of probable cause to support the charges. It is now the duty of my office to prove these charges in the indictment beyond a reasonable doubt at trial.
I'm not a lawyer, but I'm a close reader of legal documents, and having gone through the indictment, there are 41 counts and 19 defendants. And Bill, one of the things that's notable is that the bulk of these 98 pages is a set of actions that are alleged under Georgia's broad RICO statute, the racketeering law, almost treating this attempt by Trump to overturn the election as if the organization of a mob boss.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. You know, there was an old newspaper man, Stan Evans, and I was at a talk he gave on RICO once. And he said the problem with RICO is that the RICO statutes were originally directed at people with names like Rico, mob bosses. And now they're being used against people with names like Donald. I think that tells you a lot of what you need to know about the kind of laws. Look, it's becoming, if this is Tuesday, it's another indictment. It seems like every prosecutor in the country is trying to be the one who nails Donald Trump. Whatever the particular charges may be, I don't think that's healthy for the nation. And it certainly, I think, when you stretch the law, doesn't boost respect for our justice system and its impartiality.
Another thing that was notable to me is that there's not a mention here by District Attorney Fani Willis about President Trump's right to say false things under the First Amendment about the election. That was something that was notable in the federal indictment covering some of this same conduct from Special Counsel Jack Smith. That federal indictment says the defendant had a right, like every American, to speak publicly about the election and even to claim falsely that there had been outcome determinative fraud during the election and that he had won. And so Special Counsel Jack Smith goes out of his way to try to draw a line between things that Trump is saying or things that Trump is tweeting and what he says were actions in furtherance of the conspiracy that he is trying to prosecute. And it is harder to see that line in this Georgia indictment, Mene, at least from my perspective. Just to take an example of some of the acts that are alleged under this RICO charge, on or about the 5th day of January 2021, Donald John Trump caused to be tweeted from the Twitter account of Real Donald Trump, "The vice president has the power to reject fraudulently chosen electors. This was an overt act in furtherance of the conspiracy." And I don't think that that means she's trying to say that that tweet is itself a crime, but it is harder to see the line that she's trying to draw between what's criminal and what's First Amendment protected speech.
Right. It's a sweeping indictment, almost 100 pages in length, and much of it is directed toward trying to create the context in which the prosecutor's office theoretically could allege these specific crimes. So quite a lot of what's involved in the description of these 41 counts is claiming that President Trump was directly involved in denying that he had lost the election, alleging specific fraudulent acts that he thought that Democrats had committed to diminish his vote count in several jurisdictions, especially Georgia. And the reason that they mention those background facts is to suggest that specific allegations of crimes like convening the false electors, tampering with voting machines, were in fact criminal because they fit within this broader conspiracy. So I think that quite a lot of that material, as you said, is not necessarily supposed to imply a direct crime, but is supposed to create evidence for a broader conspiracy in such a way that several of the actions of Trump's advisors and his team members like Rudy Giuliani could potentially be chargeable because they belong within the umbrella of that conspiracy. But I do agree that Fani Willis was not as explicit or as careful as Jack Smith in drawing a bright line between President Trump's speech about the election and any criminal conduct that might have taken place that would have been executed by people who were a part of his team.
Another of the charges against President Trump is solicitation of violation of oath by a public officer. That's a state crime, and in one instance that refers to the call that President Trump had with Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger. And this has been public for years now. It was taped by Secretary of State Raffensperger's team and ultimately released in the press. There's been transcripts and audio of it. And so it has been discussed and debated, but let's listen to a clip just to get a flavor of it again.
There's nothing wrong with saying that, that you've recalculated, because the 2,236 and absentee ballots, I mean, they're all exact numbers that were done by accounting firms, law firms, etc. And even if you cut them in half, and cut them in half again, it's more votes than we need.
Well, Mr. President, the challenge that you have is the data you have is wrong. We talked to the congressmen, and they were surprised, but I guess there was a person named Mr. Raynard that came to these meetings and presented data. And he said that there was dead people, I believe it was upward of 5,000. The actual number were two.
Bill, part of the challenge here, it seems to me, is you have to convince potentially a jury beyond a reasonable doubt that Trump's conduct here was corrupt, that he knew that he had lost the election instead of acting on the delusion that he had won. And you can listen to large pieces of that call, and it really Trump sounds like he believes that it is impossible that he had lost the state of Georgia.
Yeah, I don't think anyone's testified or said Trump admitted to that person, that he had lost. So that's going to be hard. We also don't know all the evidence behind this, what other people are going to testify. So I think not just this case, but the other cases, there's a lot of reasonable doubt whether a jury will convict on these charges. It seems likely that with all the charges, one reason they piled on is there'll be a conviction somewhere or the other in that whole pile. I think it's likely to be Jack Smith's documents case because it's more clear-cut and doesn't involve stretching of the law. But I think it's a great loss for the country because we're discussing these individual charges and not the extraordinary fact of a presidential candidate and former president being charged by Democratic officials with a crime.
There were some elements of that call that I think are pretty hard to defend. One of them is when Brad Raffensperger says something to the effect of, you have bad evidence, we'll send you a link to our evidence. And he says, I don't need a link. I've got better proof. Another is when he suggests to Secretary of State Raffensperger that he's taking a risk and that in failing to report this voter fraud that Trump believed existed, that he and his staff could be potentially opening themselves up to a criminal defense. On the other hand, Monet, he also talks about how he had coattails. He says this again on another call that he had that was taped with a Georgia investigator. He talks about his coattails and how could these other Republicans win these races if I lost? And to my mind, the obvious answer to that question is swing voters and suburban Republicans who were fed up with Trump and didn't want another 4 years of him. And I've gone and looked at the data in some of these states, and I think it couldn't be clearer. So there was a conservative group in Wisconsin that did a hand recount of certain wards, and they found some wards where about 11% of the ballots voting for Biden also voted for Republicans for Congress. Or you can look up the vote totals. Wisconsin's 5 Republican congressmen ran about 64,000 ballots ahead of Donald Trump. And at the same time, the Democrats running in those districts ran about 64,000 votes behind Biden. So that is pretty clear evidence to me that there were many Republicans who voted Republican down ballot but did not vote Republican for Donald Trump. And yet it seems that he was not inclined to accept that point. And to the point Bill made, just in the past few days, Vice President Mike Pence was in Iowa, and he was asked whether Trump ever admitted to him that he had lost. And Vice President Pence said no.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that many of those reasons for doubting the election outcome that Trump and his team expressed in the immediate wake of the election have clearly been disproved by now. One of those chief reasons that they mentioned again and again was the discrepancy between Trump's vote totals and the vote totals of other Republicans on the ballot that November. And their allegation was always that it showed the presidential election results had been tampered with, the discrepancy, when usually you would have a nominee having coattails and tracking very closely with the performance of down-ballot candidates. Trump was overperformed by a lot of down-ballot Republicans in states like Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and others. But the solution to that question that you pointed out, I think, is the true one and the sensible one, which is that there were a lot of voters, particularly in the suburbs, middle class and upper class, around some of these big cities and these swing states where Trump simply lost a lot of support, even among traditional Republicans who still were willing to vote for other Republican candidates for different races. But I do think it's an important question still whether Trump had any sense of that truth at the time that he was on the phone with Brad Raffensperger and the Georgia election officials. It's very possible to me that he was convinced of his own victory and that in asking Brad Raffensperger to turn up the missing votes, he really thought that he was asking for justice to be done, for the election process to be corrected, because he really did believe it had been tampered with. And the same thing with the threat of retribution that you mentioned. That sounds horrible to anyone who is aware, as most of the public is today, that the election was counted accurately in Georgia. But if Trump really was under the impression that there had been fraud, it would make sense to put some pressure on the Secretary of State in that state to make sure that he got the count right and to correct it. And so that's just a preview of the legal defense that the Trump team is going to make with regard to every single one of these allegations. As long as Trump really believed that the election had been fraudulent, his denials of the proper election procedure taking place and his actions to correct the outcome theoretically could be legal and within his authority as president to do.